Okay, it is 12:30. So we can go ahead and get started. I'm sure other folks are going to be trickling in. Welcome to today's webinar on Agroforestry 101. This webinar is really focused on why folks might be interested in planting trees on their farmlands. And this webinar is co-presented with the Savanna Institute, the Liberty Prairie Foundation, the Delta Institute, and supported by the US EPA. This project with the US EPA is focused on water quality on farmlands and downstream here in Illinois and Wisconsin. And we're going to be working on a 3-year project to see how agroforestry can be a tool in the toolbox to help improve water quality here and below us. So my name is Katie Adams, and I am the Illinois Community Agroforester at the Savanna Institute. And I am based in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, but work kind of broadly throughout the state. And my work focuses on connecting farmers and landowners and institutions and organizations to the resources and opportunities to introduce trees and agroforestry onto agricultural landscapes here in Illinois. Savanna Institute is based in Illinois and both Wisconsin, but I mostly work here in East Central. And the photo to your right is an example of one of our demonstration farms in Monticello, Illinois, and to me a good illustration of why I do this work. So this photo was taken in early March of 2021. And we have these green strips of perennial ground cover and trees that are doing a great job of being green and providing habitat and also keeping soil in place through the winter months. And we'll get into a little bit more on alley cropping and this particular practice here in a little bit. But before we do that, I'd love to introduce the partners that are working on this EPA project and are co-hosting this webinar today. And a little bit on why we're focusing on agroforestry. So I'm going to kick it off to Nathan, who is our partner through the Liberty Prairie Foundation. Nathan, would you like to introduce yourself and your work?
Sure. Thank you, Katie, so much. We're really excited about this project and working with our other partners. And we are excited in part because we're an organization that really is interested in how people and nature can creatively work together. We're located within the Prairie Crossing Conservation Community in Grays Lake, which is kind of reimagined suburbia with conservation and land. And we have a 94-acre farm that we use for a lot of different programs. We've always been interested in farming that brings together nutrition and conservation and regeneration of the land. So when the Savanna Institute reached out to explore our interest, we were super happy. Our role in particular is to use our Northeast Illinois FarmLink program as a way to make more landowners and farmers aware of agroforestry and the many benefits that it brings.
Thanks, Nathan. Next are another partner, Delta Institute.
Thanks, Katie. My name is Josh Zuckerman. I'm the lead for the Resilient Agriculture portfolio at the Delta Institute. Delta at large helps Midwestern communities adopt sustainability solutions. And in our agriculture portfolio, we work with organizations such as Liberty and Savanna to put on webinars like these or various other projects throughout the state, including the Midwest at large. So here's a little slide for what we've got going on, and I'd be happy to answer any questions about Delta if you have them further into the webinar or follow up with me afterwards. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Josh. And Lucas is also joining us from Delta Institute. Thanks for being here, Lucas. And Savanna Institute is a third partner. Here's just a little bit about us as a nonprofit and kind of what we're focused on. I'll talk about that a little bit more at the end, about how we can support folks interested in incorporating trees onto their landscapes. And we're really excited to have so many wonderful partners that work with us to help contribute their expertise and their goals into our work as well. So as you might have heard, I have a baby strapped to me right now. I didn't have child care for today, so my little barnacle Willow is going to be joining us as well. So if you hear some coos or some cries, that's just her, but she's napping now, so she's also excited to learn about trees. So before we dive into more of the content of the webinar, we'd like to know a little bit about who you are and why you're here. So Lucas is going to throw a couple polls up, and we just ask that you spend a couple seconds answering a few questions so that we can better tailor this presentation to you. So the first one is, who are you? You can take a second to indicate who you are. I'm sure you're many more things than these, but just you can choose multiples of these as well. Okay, we're going to go ahead and close that one out. So it looks like 58% are agency employees, but we have a good mix of farmers and landowners, as well as other nonprofit folks and folks that fall outside of that kind of multiple choice question. So if you put other in there, we'd love to hear who you are and why you're here. Okay, let's move on to the next one. Why are you here? Why are you joining us today? What can we provide for you out of the time that we have together today? Okay, let's go ahead and close that one out. Great. So the majority of folks are here to help advise folks that might be interested in adding trees to their agricultural landscapes. 50% of you are generally curious. Same here. I'm just a generally curious person, so happy to see that. And some folks are also ready to get started, interested in how they might do that on their own landscapes. And then similar before, if you said other, would love to hear. So this one is something that I always love to ask folks when we're talking about agroforestry or trees on ag land is, what are the common concerns? What common concerns have you heard about trees on farms? So we'll take a couple moments to answer this one. Okay, let's go ahead and close that one out. But split that trees decrease crop yield and trees are hard to work around. Those are common ones that I hear a lot too. Looks like tile lines are coming in there. I live in and work in Champaign County. A lot of our farmland is tiled, and that trees are for conservation only. Great. And if you have another, definitely throw that one in the chat so we can try to talk about that through our presentation. There's lots of different ones, but we try to do the ones that folks we've heard the most. Okay. And on a scale of 1 to 10, how much do you know about agroforestry? So how much do you know already about trees on ag land? Granted, we haven't had the presentation yet. So just throw your number in where you think you lie. Okay, let's go ahead and close that one out. And we'll do this one again at the end as well to see where folks are. So it looks like we have a pretty good split of folks. And we're kind of sitting right in the middle with I'm familiar, but not an expert. So hopefully this will nudge folks up a little bit more as we go through our presentation and provide some more resources for folks to get started. Thank you so much for taking the time to answer those questions for us. Okay, now we're gonna roll into more of the meat and potatoes, or I'm an agroforester, so chestnuts and pawpaws of the presentation. Before we kind of get started on what agroforestry is, I want us to step back a little bit and think about the landscapes on which we live and work, and think about what was here before much of the agriculture that we see around the state today. In Illinois, with a state that's so full of ag land, the majority of our landscape is in agriculture currently. It's kind of hard to think about what was here before that the vast agricultural land in production that we have today. So one of the things that I think about often is, were there trees on this landscape before we started farming it? So here where I am in East Central Illinois, where we have some of the most valuable agricultural land in the country for corn and soybean production, I often hear that trees weren't on this landscape before, so it doesn't make sense to put them in now. But East Central Illinois was actually swampland. It was very wet, it was wetlands, and they were full of scrubby and brushy trees. So for example, Champaign County was once covered in hazelnuts, to the point where it was the last section of the state to be settled, because people did not like rolling through the vast amounts of hazelnuts that were on the landscape. So it wasn't really seen as a place that was great for agriculture until it was drained and then put into agricultural land. So now that we have, the agricultural landscape that we have today, sometimes we like to, sorry, let me back up for a second here. I was fumbling over my words a little bit. Oftentimes on our landscape now, we see these kind of pockets of different things happening. So we might see agriculture in one section of a land, conservation as an edge of practice, edge of field practice on the edges, and then some natural lands that are off to the side, or sometimes, depending on where you're at in the state, pretty far from where you are. So we kind of have these divisions set up on our landscapes. And one of the things that agroforestry does is try to bring these three sort of things back together. So we spend a little bit of time thinking about the ways that we can bring conservation from edge of field practices into agricultural practices in field. And we'll talk about how that can happen throughout our presentation. So we've talked a lot about agroforestry so far, but we haven't actually defined it. So a very simple definition of agroforestry is farming systems that integrate trees, crops, and livestock. So these farming systems are intentional and they can be intensive, but trees are kind of at the center of that. So we have trees that are productive, trees that can help support productive crops, and trees that can help support livestock. And there's lots of different ways that this can manifest, but today we're going to be focusing on 5 USDA definitions. So before we get into those definitions, why trees? Why are we focused on trees at all when it comes to farm landscapes? The 3 big ones are that they're perennial. So we have living roots in the ground. They're woody, so they're able to capture and store carbon. They have adaptive and relational root systems, which means that they're able to communicate, pull and share nutrients across the landscape. And they provide habitat and fodder that can be for wildlife or for livestock, and they can help with yield support. So one of the things that folks indicated as a concern that they've heard is that trees can decrease yield, when in actuality, when we work with different practices, we can help boost and support those yields. And the last one, which I always throw in here, which I think is important, is that trees are beautiful. Everyone loves sitting underneath a shady tree on a hot summer day like we're experiencing now, and just enjoy the leaves rustling through the wind and just all the beauty that those trees can bring. And the benefits of agroforestry are related to those. So agroforestry, so the incorporation of trees into agriculture, can support climate solutions. They can purify water, which is what we're focused on through this US EPA project. They can help diversify farm income by providing profitable crops in with the trees or the trees themselves. They can improve soil health, provide more food options for folks and communities, support livestock, and then increase the habitat around us. So we can do a lot of different things at once with trees. So the 5 practices that are supported by the USDA include alley cropping, which is the cultivation of crops and alleys between regularly spaced rows of trees and shrubs. So here is an illustration of example of what that might look like over time. When we think about trees, they're a really long-term decision. So we have to think about what happened now, as well as in 11 and 20 plus years, and even sometimes 100 years down the road. Silvopasture is the second practice supported by the USDA. This is the intentional integration of trees, pasture, and livestock managed in one single system. So the single system is kind of important because it means that it's a planned incorporation of trees into an already supported grazing system. So there's two different types. There's silvopasture by addition, which is what we see often here in Illinois, where we're planting trees into pasture for livestock. And then there's silvopasture by subtraction, which is where we're creating an intensive grazing plan within a wooded area. Agroforestry is much different than just turning animals out into a wooded landscape. It's very much planned and those designs are to support the woodland system itself, as well as the livestock that are being incorporated into it. Riparian buffers are the third one. And so these are strips of permanent vegetation. For us, that includes trees along streams, lakes, or wetlands. And this is to support water quality, to improve aquatic habitat, as well as to provide habitat for terrestrial wildlife as well. And then there's windbreaks, which we often see here in the windy central part of the state, but as we often also see out in the Western Plains. And those are strips of trees and shrubs designed to enhance crop or livestock production, while also providing conservation benefits. So windbreaks are really for the benefit of the crop or the livestock that they're adjacent to. And they can provide a lot of different other functions, which we'll cover here in a little bit. And then the last one is forest farming. This is one we don't see so much here in central Illinois, but we see at the bottom of the state, up a little north and west, and definitely in Wisconsin, as well as Appalachia and lots of areas in the United States that have naturally wooded areas. And forest farming is the cultivation of specialty crops under forest canopies. So these include things like mushroom production. So mushrooms need shade to produce, so they thrive in woody areas, or things like medicinal herbs like ginseng, golden seal, and can also include things like maple syruping and maple sugaring. So those are kind of the broad definitions of what agroforestry is. But what does agroforestry look like here in Illinois and here in the Midwest? I'm going to go through a couple different examples of agroforestry happening on the ground here, so you can kind of connect the ways that these practices can come to bear on the landscapes and with the farmers and landowners in which you work with. So this photo here is Savanna Institute staff installing a edible riparian buffer at one of our demonstration farms called Field Restored, and we'll talk about the design here in a little bit. So the first farm that I'm going to talk about is the Memorial 4-H Camp Farm in Monticello, Illinois. And this is a row crop and timber alley cropping. So this alley cropping demonstration was designed to help increase soil health, help sink carbon, help slow down water that was moving across the landscape, as well as provide wildlife habitat. We also have a ground cover experiment happening here. On the left, we have clover and perennial ryegrass as our ground cover, and this is the summer version of the photo that you saw on my intro slide. And on the right side, we have a shortgrass prairie ground cover. So we're really trying to experiment on best practices for alley cropping here in Illinois and the Midwest. And the timber species that we're working with there are swamp white oak, shagbark hickory, black walnut, and we're doing a controlled black locust experiment for timber. Black locust is a really controversial tree, so I'm sure we'll have some questions on that later, and I'm happy to talk about that down the line. And so this is 35 acres where we worked with the current row crop farmer to come up with spacing that fit the goals of the trees as well as the goals of the crops that were being farmed between the trees. And so our goal was to help boost the yield of the farmer, as well as provide all the benefits that I talked about previously, where we put the trees, and then we have a sellable product at the end of the transition of this plan. The second are hedgerows. These are things we don't see very often on the landscape anymore. We sometimes see old Osage orange hedgerows left on the edges of farmland. But these hedgerows here are at Allerton Park and managed by the Savanna Institute. And here we use hybrid hazelnuts. to provide wildlife habitat, as well as a demarcating buffer that also have a profitable product at the end. So we're working with hybrid hazelnuts and doing a kind of growth trial here to see how those work as hedgerows. The third is a native polyculture windbreak, and this is at Vulcan Farm in Sidney, Illinois. And this windbreak incorporates different edible crops. So we have blackberries and black raspberries, hazelnuts, plums, elderberry and persimmon, as well as hybrid poplar and red cedar. And this was designed to, to provide some drift protection from the neighboring farmer, as well as wind protection, provide habitat for wildlife in the area, as well as provide some beauty on that landscape as well. And this also has the added benefit of slowing down and sinking water during snow melt, as well as when we have pretty intense rainfalls. So the farm that behind it, that is a grazing operation, sees a lot less kind of saturated soils long-term thanks to this windbreak. Another example from near Sidney is Saturn Farm in Ogden, Illinois. And this is a pretty intense perennial alley cropping system that also has a windbreak. So here we have currants and hazelnuts and black locust. Sorry, I'm just going to be, kind of bopping around here. But this is a alley cropping farm that has a perennial crop in the alleys. So where we saw corn and soybeans at the Morrill 4-H farm, now we have asparagus, currants, and rhubarb. And those are planted in between rows of black locust and pawpaws. So here we have a saleable perennial crop throughout the entire alley cropping system. This farm is also surrounded by a windbreak to protect from wind and drift, as they're kind of the only trees in this area for a couple of miles. This was also set up . Sorry, everybody. I was trying to type some questions in the chat, but couldn't make it happen. This is Willow. We also have a windbreak going around the entire farm to help protect from drift and wind. The last option the last example I'm going to mention today is a vegetable operation. So this is a farm I used to manage in Ferguson, Missouri. And here we have annual vegetables planted between rows of fruit trees and pollinator plants. So this farm was on a 6% grade. And so it's also in a berm and swale system. So the picture on the right shows trees that are planted on a berm and then have a trench below it. And so this is flowing down water. The water is hitting those trees, sinking in, going into the swale beneath it, and then protecting those crops from more soil erosion. Over time, these alleys will become more and more shaded by the trees. And so there's plans to transition that production to different parts of the farm. So there's a constant succession happening to allow for annual production to transition to perennial production. And I included all the spacing for these farms because it's important to think about the ways that we move throughout those spaces and the ways that we can incorporate farmer and landowner equipment and needs into our tree cropping systems. And then the last one is Fields Restored, which is a demonstration farm for the Savanna Institute. So this is another angle of the photo we saw before I started going through examples. And this is a multifunctional and edible riparian buffer. So it is kind of at the bottom of a slope. So to the north, we have a continuously grazed pasture. To the south, we have cropland. And so we have runoff from both a pasture and some cropland that are going into the creek that is kind of in the middle of these tree tubes here. So to meet the landowner goal, we designed an edible riparian buffer that helps support the water quality and the erosion that was happening along that creek, while also incorporating some edible products, as well as decorative things like red dogwood and yellow dogwood that can be sold to florists, because the landowner already has those relationships with buyers. Okay, so I have a couple of minutes left before we're going to open it up for questions, which I know there's a ton of coming through the chat. So why trees? Why is the US EPA interested in agroforestry and incorporating trees onto farm landscapes for water quality? So the root of the matter is that we're seeing still increased nitrogen and phosphorus runoff from farmland. And we have a lot of different tools in our toolbox to help address that. And we're also seeing quite a bit of soil erosion as well, although I would say that that is getting a little bit better, but we're still seeing water runoff events as we see kind of the extreme weather that we're noticing this year. Right now it's hot and dry, but earlier this year it was very wet and we would have some very large rain events. I'm sorry, my slides are not working very well. But the root of the matter is that roots matter. When we put perennial roots in the ground, especially those of trees that can have both lateral and tap roots, depending on the species, those roots can help capture nutrients before they penetrate down deeper. And as well as they can stabilize soil to keep soil in place and nitrogen and phosphorus in place during large rain and runoff events. So we know that perennial buffers and perennial crops are one of the best tools in our toolbox to help address water quality. So when we're looking at nitrate reduction, we know that perennial buffers and perennial crops can give up to a 90% reduction per acre. So while nitrification inhibitors, cover crops, and wetlands are extremely important, and they need to be designed and implemented in concert with agroforestry, we can get the most bang for our buck with these perennial practices. So, sorry. So we're going back to this slide that I had earlier, where we kind of had these demarcations between agriculture, conservation, and the natural world. What we try to do with agroforestry, and which we can see in this photo here is a step in the right direction, is combining agriculture, conservation, and the natural world all into one system. So an alley cropping system can bring together all three of these things. We have the trees integrated with the corn. So we have our conservation, our agriculture together, and the use of native trees, as well as the introduction of an incorporation of pollinators and wildlife support, can help bring that natural world element of what we think of as nature into our farming systems as well. While some folks might see that as a detraction because there might be some pest issues or things like fear that come in, good design can help address those issues so that all three can work together. And while there's challenges, there's also lots of opportunities to fine-tune these systems and provide lots of solutions to the opportunities as well as the challenges that we face as conservation professionals and folks that work with farmers and landowners. So the Savanna Institute is here to help with folks that are interested in incorporating trees and agroforestry onto their landscape. We provide technical support for farmers and landowners, as well as folks who work in soil conservation districts and NRCS in southern and northeastern Wisconsin, as well as northern and central Illinois. We also, there's also many agroforestry practices right now that are supported through NRCS and other programs. So these are just a few that we can help provide technical assistance around, and that might have new payment scenarios or practice standards. And some include harvest of fruit and nuts, as well as ornamentals and timber as part of those practices. We also offer lots of other programs for folks who are more generally interested in agroforestry. including education and outreach materials. So we have tons of resources on our website. We have an agroforestry apprenticeship program, and we also launched a new business called Canopy Farm Management that can help with establishment and maintenance of agroforestry systems. So thank you all so much for your time and your grace when it came to a crying baby. I appreciate that so much. So I'd love to open the floor to questions now so we can have a conversation around trees on Illinois agricultural lands. So thank you so much. And Josh, I'm going to hand it over to you for some questions from folks.
Sure. Katie, thank you so much. It's really great to hear your knowledge of the agroforestry system and the work that you're up to in Illinois, also while just taking care of Willow and doing such a great job at that. So it was really wonderful to hear you give that presentation today. So we have a couple questions starting to flow in, and please feel free to type questions into chat. I'm going to go ahead and ask a question that I'm personally interested in because I finally have that chance to do so in front here. My big interest is the return on investment of these systems. I understand planting trees is a lot of money, it's a lot of labor. What are the models of ROI that you've seen out there? Or can you just like tell us your experience with what the numbers kind of look like?
Sure, this is a really great question and a really vital one for folks that are interested in these long-term systems. Agriculture is risky no matter what type of ag you're working with, and perennial cropping systems can be even more risky. So what I'd like to say, there's a one-size-fits-all answer to your question. It really depends on the landscape, the farmer and landowner, and the goals that they have. So if you're looking at full commercial production, so if we're looking at something like the commercial blackcurrant production that was mentioned at Saturn Farm earlier, that has a very particular kind of set of economics associated with it. And currants were chosen because they have a quicker return on investment than things like fruit or nut trees that can take longer to bear. So for example, black currants can start fruiting in year 3 and can come into full production by year 5. And they also can be commercially harvested, and they can be pruned and maintained with a little bit less labor. So at the beginning of the presentation, someone had a concern about labor, which is a huge one when we think about different crops, and specifically perennial crops. So they are much higher labor sometimes than they are for, say, corn or soybeans or small grain production. But it depends on, 1, how much land that you're looking to put into production. 2, if you're looking to go for a smaller scale planting or a larger scale planting. 3, are you interested in incorporating mechanization at all? Or are you interested in doing that labor by hand? And 4, do you have markets readily available to you? So doing that research ahead of time can help you build the economics and the scale that's possible for your landscape. So we do have some good resources on particular crops and are working to build those out more. So we have information on chestnuts and hazelnuts when it comes to the economics and some of the choices you can make there. And we're building those portfolios for things like elderberry, black currants, and other crops that do here well in the Midwest, and that people are interested in incorporating. So when we think about ways that we can build it into things like windbreaks or riparian buffers and things that often are seen purely as conservation practices, then we really have to think about the time and labor aspect as well as the crops that are possible there. So I can't give you any cold hard numbers, but as you work through the technical service program, if you're interested in that, those are something that Sven Peel, our Illinois TSP, or Matt in with Illinois, or Matt Wilson in Wisconsin can help build out those ROI numbers for folks.
That's really great. It'll be so interesting to see over the years the farms developing and have implemented agroforestry to see what those numbers do come out to be, to really be able to like see for models of scale. Really interesting things there. We have a question from Michelle. Any issues with herbicide use on the row crop lanes affecting the other vegetation, either drift or moving through the soil?
Yeah, this is a really good question and one that we get a lot, especially for folks that are interested in certified organic production. So one of the things that we think about a lot, especially when it comes to windbreaks, are ways that windbreaks can help protect from drift. The first and best way of preventing drift is to know your neighbor, have good conversations and good relationships with your neighbor, and talk about ways that you can work together to protect both their business that can rely on herbicide application, as well as the goals and your business that you might have, and how to protect those. The second is you can build buffers. So depending on what's being sprayed and the wind direction that's coming onto your farm, you can build a windbreak that's specifically designed to prevent herbicide drift. And that's through the air. So there's certain things that are more volatile than others, but a windbreak can be a good first defense in that. As far as herbicide or pesticide leaching through the soil, that is something that I don't have expertise in. So if there are folks on this call that have more of that information, please drop that through the chat, and they would be able to answer that more. But we do know that perennial roots in soil can help capture that and slow it down. So depending on the deepness of the roots and the species that you choose, they can help stop that from going on to other farmland. But like I said, I'm not an expert in that. So I can do more research on that and connect with folks that do know more about that.
And also, as these systems evolve and there's more diversity on a farm, it'll be interesting to see if there will be reductions in pesticides necessary as we increase biodiversity and it starts to create its natural combating there for the product.
Yeah. And I will say that we just hired a water quality specialist that is working on research to specifically answer this question. So that research is going to be focused in Wisconsin, but he's using lithometers and some other measurement devices to really see how well these perennial systems are doing that work.
Cool, very cool. Question from Lynn, and you mentioned it earlier, the confrontation possibly with it. Did planting black walnut have any ill effects on the ground or plants around them due to the presence of juglone? And I think you mentioned black locust earlier too, to see what the confrontation was there, if you could touch on that.
Yeah, so black walnut does have allelopathic properties, but it really depends on what you have planted around it. So while it affects certain things, like I'm a recovering vegetable farmer, right? So black walnut affects nightshade plants. So you can't plant things like eggplant or tomatoes near a black walnut because the juglone does have negative effects. But there's many plants and trees specifically that have really productive and beneficial relationships with black walnut. So it's something to consider, but it's not necessarily a hindrance in any way, shape, or form. When we're trying to decide what trees to plant on the landscape, of course, we look at soil, we look at pH, and we also look at, the ecosystem and habitat in which will inhabits, right? So black walnut in the wild exists with a huge array of plants around it. Hundreds of different species of plants that exist with black walnut. So deciding what those species are and how they fit into the goals of your business and landscape is going to be important. So juglone, I like to think of it as not a hindrance, but a kind of a good way of setting boundaries on what options you can incorporate in planting with black walnut.
That just shows, Katie, right there, how worthwhile it is to reach out to the Savanna Institute if you're looking for technical support services and you're interested in integrating agroforestry on your farm. Definitely reach out. They're there to help. They're there to answer your questions. Let's see here. Eric, can you speak more to the strategy of reducing wildlife damage? Also, any beaver issues in your northern areas, particularly those riparian buffers?
Yeah, I feel like we get the beaver question a lot, and it's something that we're doing more research into and talking with more folks about as we expand our work and really start to work on more varied and diverse landscapes. I am not an expert with beavers, but from the reading I've done, the folks that I've talked to that have worked within beaver habitats before. One of the things that we've been thinking about when it came to a client we're working with in Northern Illinois that does have some beaver pressure in the area they're looking to incorporate agroforestry into. When we ask landowners and farmers to talk about their goals, we often ask who are the primary decision makers for this farm and for this planting. So oftentimes it's things like family members or landowners if they're renting land. But we kind of started to think, well, what if the beaver was one of those decision makers? The beaver is on the landscape already, and they are making decisions for what happens on the landscape. So what if we designed the beaver as being one of those primary decision makers? So that means not planting trees that beavers are particularly attracted to, or planting trees that they want to avoid, or setting up the planting systems in areas where they are not, that aren't in the path of where they're going to spend most of their time. So are there different ways that we can plant towards working with beavers and put things that aren't as desirable for them and coexist on that landscape? Because they are part of our habitat and they are part of that ecosystem. And they are doing a job that they're designed to do. But it's hard to think of ways within an agricultural system you can do that. When it comes to deer are really hard, right? Because they like to eat a lot of things that we like to grow. So just about anything that we want to eat or we want to sell as agricultural products, a deer is really into. So I have no answer when it comes to deer, but there's a lot of different ways to approach it. So there's exclusionary ways to deal with deer. So setting up different types of deer fencing. So you can put up, an 8 to 12 foot deer fence, and that can be permanent or temporary, depending on your budget and your goal landscape. You can set up something called a 3D fence, which we've seen some success with, which is just 2 or 3 hot wires that create there are 2 hot wires and then 1 offset, so that when a deer is coming at it, they see it as much larger than it actually is. And then they avoid it because they don't think that they can get through it. And that's a pretty cheap option. And then kind of like the cop-out answer is plant enough to share, which is easier said than done. Plant enough to share and then protect what you have planted. So we use things like 6-foot tree tubes to protect the tree trunks from buck rub, as well as from browsing, because that's above browse height. But we have seen, depending on where you're at in the deer pressure, that's not always the most perfect solution, but it helps a lot. So we kind of have to look at the economic threshold of damage. So what can we put into place that can protect our crops from getting to a point where all of the work and all the investment was for naught because of deer damage.
Great. I'm gonna just keep going. We've got about 15 more minutes for questions here, so I'm just gonna keep going through them, getting some really great content out of this. Is there any help from Sunil? Is there any help for small scale farmers to get started in agroforestry? Not just the big farms, but also the small farmers out there.
Yeah, so the great thing about agroforestry is it can happen at any scale. So as long as there's agriculture happening, so if we use the USDA definition, right? So the USDA definition of a farm is if you're raising $1,000 worth of agricultural products. So that can be, at a pretty small scale. $1,000 isn't that much. So at the Savanna Institute, we work with a range of farm sizes. So anywhere from 1 acre up to 1,000+ acres, because trees can fit into every agricultural landscape. So it really depends on your goals and how we can help you achieve those with the incorporation of trees. So the vegetable farm that I mentioned earlier in the presentation, Earthstand, that alley cropping system of trees and vegetables was on 1 acre. So we did all of our outdoor growing on 1 acre with the incorporation of the trees. So it's very possible. And that's why working with folks that specifically know how to design to long-term perennial systems can be really helpful in figuring out ways to add trees into that system.
This next one, Katie, is outside of the Midwestern trees that we grow here, but I want to see if you've got an answer for it. Saeed's writing, and I'm working on cashew nut, coffee, macadamia nuts, and cocos. I want to include other plants like medicinals and timbers. How would I design such an agroforestry project? I know we don't know where he's logging in from, but it's definitely not our climate.
Yeah, I don't work in tropical systems, and I wish that I did, because those are things that I love.
Sure.
All things that I love. But there are different organizations around the world that can help with that. So the World Agroforestry Congress is coming up here in July, and that's a gathering of folks from around the world to share research and different strategies for agroforestry across the globe. So folks that will be joining there, and there's a big list of folks that are going to be there, so that might be a good list to mine. But really, if you think generally to the ways that we design agroforestry, the big things are, one, what are your goals? Are your goals to create as much profit as possible over a short time period or a long time period? Are your goals to incorporate soil health or carbon capture within those systems? How much land do you have to work with? And what is your timeline for establishing all of those crops into it? What can you do in year 1? What can you do in year 3? And what could be possible in year 10? What are the relationships between all of those crops? When are they blooming? When are they fruiting? Do you have the labor to work with all of those crops in one system? Is that labor spread out, and is it readily available? And what do your markets look like? So where are those crops going to go off the farm? So do you have something that will produce a little quicker, that has a ready market now, so you can start the cash flow? And there's things that will start to produce a little bit further down the line that maybe doesn't have so much of a market, but will by the time, hopefully, that they start to produce. So we have some really great planning resources on our website and as part of our online course. So that could, while those are focused on the Midwest, some of those bigger ideas might be helpful in thinking of how you can design your farm landscape.
Great. Since you brought it up, and this is our next question, Fabio is asking, what is your idea about carbon credits and carbon farming and agroforestry? Is there a best system for carbon sequestration at scale, potential carbon sequestration per hectare, per acre?
This is a huge question.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of different ideas within the agroforestry community and the larger agricultural community. So depending on who you talk to, some folks are really excited about carbon credits, and some folks are way more hesitant about carbon credits. I think that one of the things that is big in that conversation right now is how to ensure that the folks that have been doing these practices that are really focused on carbon sequestration are recognized and celebrated, and if carbon credits become, more of a program, how are they brought into that system? And how are we ensuring that folks are making decisions that allow for long-term protection and long-term continuation of these systems in ways that are supported through their farm businesses and their landscapes, and not just a carbon credit program. So the Savanna Institute doesn't have a stance on carbon credits because it is such a nuanced sort of situation. In terms of the best system for carbon sequestration at scale, it depends on where you are, it depends on your soils, and it depends on the species that you incorporate, as well as your management system of those species. So this is the hard thing, right? There's not a one-size-fits-all calculation for carbon sequestration, but we do have some good research and some good numbers. So the University of Missouri, as well as the USDA National Agroforestry Center, has some pretty good numbers on those things in terms of like alley cropping systems with black walnut and wheat and those sort of things. So those numbers, I can't pull off the top of my head. I wish I could. There's only so much room in this brain. But the USDA National Agroforestry Center has some really great data on that when it comes to the US and what we have here. There is immense need for more research on this topic for our soils and the species that we work with here in the Midwest.
Great. It's a good time for me to plug, I believe, because carbon credit in agroforestry might be a good topic for discussion further along. We'll be producing 7 more webinars over the next year and a half or so, with topics to be developed based off of your feedback and what we're getting from our viewers and our participants here. We really want to cater this to you guys and really provide all of the information we know out there. So maybe further down the line as carbon credits evolve and new things do come out, could be a great webinar and a topic for discussion for a while. There's a question that came in about harvesting nut trees when they're mature and any special equipment from Kimberly, if any special equipment is required to do so. And maybe you could touch more on the lines of what equipment and knowledge is necessary as you really evolve these systems into more advanced systems. Are there tools out there available to really progress the farmer along? Are those tools adaptable to machineries that they already have?
Yeah, this equipment one's a really important one. And equipment is a primary design consideration when it comes to agroforestry systems that also have a profitable crop attached to them. And the equipment varies depending on your scale. So there's folks that plant, say, for example, U-pick. A U-pick operation that's incorporating hazelnuts and chestnuts on, say, like a 2 to 5 acre scale. You can have folks harvest it for you if that's something you're interested in incorporating into your business plans, and they can use something called a nut wizard, which is something that you roll across the ground. It's a hand tool that picks up chestnuts and hazelnuts. As we're going into kind of a larger scale, so if we're looking at plantings of, say, like 10 to 25, 50 acres, then there's different things such as nut vacuums, which sounds really funny, but this is something that's often used in Europe. So the nuts fall onto the ground. So, and then you use this vacuum either attached to your back or as part of a tractor implement to come and suck up those nuts, and then you can sort those nuts, dehusk them, and then process them. There's shakers, so machines that you can attach to your tractor or another implement with an umbrella. You put the umbrella underneath the tree, you shake the tree, the nuts fall into the umbrella. But there's a lot of innovation happening in Europe, and most of the equipment that we use for nut harvesting comes from Europe. Although in Oregon, where there's a lot more nut production, or in, say, California, where we're looking at things like Carpathian walnuts and almonds, they have equipment that's specialized specifically to the particular nut. So this is one thing that we're trying to amass, is all this information about all the different options for those. So we have that information for chestnuts and hazelnuts. So we have a chestnut commercialization report as well as a hazelnut commercialization report that has lots of different options when it comes to harvest as well as processing and marketing, specifically for those 2 nut crops.
That you spoke a little bit on research there. Neri was asking if there's any ongoing research you're focusing on, valuable research questions. Barbara did answer that for us in the chat, so I'm just going to keep moving along with some questions. We've got a lot of compliments for the webinar. Thank you guys for coming in and tuning in for it. We really appreciate it. All right, Bart, we don't seem to have any other questions. If anyone wants to ask, please feel free. We do have 6 minutes left on this webinar. I do have another question that I'm personally curious about, because failures are a thing on farms. When I was farming, I failed all the time. I tried integrating Icelandic sheep into a maple beech forest. It was an experiment. Maybe it worked, maybe it didn't. The sheep seemed happy. What are the biggest mistakes people commonly make in starting agroforestry systems?
Yeah, some of the biggest mistakes that I've made and that
Personally,
I've seen
sure.
other folks make, because I've killed a lot of trees. Anyone that's doing something new for the first time or is learning as they go, I'm very young, you make some mistakes over time. But the mistake that I see folks make often, and what I've made myself, is wrong tree, wrong place. So not taking the time to really examine your soils, doing soil testing, checking the pH of the soil, looking at soil composition, looking at depth of water table and depth restrictive features, and not choosing the right species that's going to work within that soil and within that particular context. So as a context thing, you know, placing trees that don't do well under wind stress in unprotected areas, planting trees into frost pockets that have early bloom times, planting trees into areas that are heavily traversed by wildlife, so not knowing the wildlife movement on your farm, and also placing trees where you'll see a lot of water stress. So in the areas where you think, oh, a tree will do well here because it's so wet. Certain trees do well and shrubs do well in wet areas and others don't. So really knowing your soil, your landscape, and your tree can put you leaps and bounds ahead of other folks. And sometimes that takes a little bit of time. So we have some really great tools. We have soil and water conservation districts and folks at NRCS who can help with those sort of technical questions, as well as our technical service providers. We have tools like Web Soil Survey that can give you a really good overview of the soils where you are. And then we have the time and observation of actually watching the landscape and observing throughout a season or throughout a year. So kind of the biggest thing that we can do is watch, listen, and sit for a little bit to learn as much as possible before we design and implement agroforestry systems.
Sure. So you've kind of allured to it a few times through your conversation today. With our final 2 minutes that we have for this webinar, what is like a quick answer? We could get into it much further, but what is the timeline for planning an agroforestry system? There's a lot of planning, there's a lot of business planning, there's a lot of thought that needs to go in. We need to test soils. We really need to know our land. What's the timeline like for really like getting a good plan put together?
It depends, which is such an unsatisfying answer that I always give when it comes to agroforestry systems. But it depends. If you are completely new to a landscape, or you're completely new to farming, you've never worked with trees before, the timeline might be a little bit longer because you need to learn a little bit more about the ways that you work, the way the landscape works, and the community around you to figure out what's going to be the best way to design and incorporate agroforestry. There's farmers and landowners that we've worked with that have been working on their land for a long time. They're really enmeshed in their communities. They've been thinking through different options. They know their land, like they know their children, and they can see the opportunities as well as some of the challenges on that land and in their farm businesses. And they're thinking long term, right? So they're thinking about succession. And so for folks like that, the timeline can be a little faster because they've done a lot of the groundwork. They've done a lot of the internal education and thinking and are ready to implement pretty quickly. So I would say anywhere from 3 months to a year to 5 years, you know, depending on what's happening. And agroforestry can be something that you think about now, and then you think about ways to add trees over time. So when we think of the ways that natural landscapes change, it's through succession. So different plants and species come in at different times, depending on the soil and the ecosystem conditions. So when we think about incorporating agroforestry, we definitely have to think about that in a succession mindset as well. So how can we use trees to help meet the goals of our farm and landscape, but also create succession over time? So things that are happening during our lifetime, things that are happening during the next generation and further down the line. So, and that's one of the reasons why Savanna Institute is here in our technical service program, and all of our partners, such as the Liberty Prairie Foundation and the Delta Institute, is to help think through options for long-term planning and to be supportive to soil and water conservation districts, NRCS, and farmers and landowners, because we're all committed to healthier lands, healthier soils, and healthier waters. So in this way, we can all work together for those healthy successions as well.
Great, Katie, that was wonderful. Thank you so much for your presentation today. We really appreciate everyone logging in. We know this is lunch hour. I hope this was really beneficial for everyone. We love feedback. We have a survey here at the end, and really thank you for logging in today. And Katie, really fantastic job today. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. Please reach out to me, other Liberty Prairie Foundation, Allerton Institute, or anyone at SI. We'd love to keep the conversation going and help you incorporate agroforestry into your work and landscapes.
Great, thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.